Hello and welcome to another episode of Cognition. As always, I'm Hutch. I am a innovation principal at Trace3. I am the creator of the Sociosploit blog and the author of the book, The Language of Deception, Weaponizing Next Generation AI.
And I am Len Noe, technical evangelist, Whitehat, and transhuman for CyberArk, as well as the author of the upcoming book, Human Hacked, My Life and Lessons as the First Augmented Ethical Hacker.
And today, consistent with our general routine, we're first going to talk about a few different interesting news articles. We're going to start with Boston Dynamics' new humanoid robot. We're then going to talk about a scientific paper about the risks of increasingly deploying low orbit Earth satellites, and then look at DeepMind and Google's new commitments to continuing the AI scaling race, and also talk about the fact that MITRE was breached in a cyber attack. And then for the main segment, we are going to talk about ethics and how that intersects with emerging technology and future trends. So with that, we'll go ahead and jump right into it.
Before we get too deep into the news, man, I'm wondering if we maybe should rename this segment from news to just nightmares. You know,
I think a lot of times that is, I think it would definitely be a good fit.
because I mean, we never get happy news in cyber anymore.
No, for sure we don't. This is, and speaking of nightmares, so for anybody that hasn't seen the video yet, it is a very short 1-minute demonstration of Boston Dynamics' new humanoid robot. And this thing is terrifying. Len, what were your first thoughts when you saw this?
My first thoughts were the same ones that we had when we talked about this in depth. You guys are all in trouble. Even Dracula needed Renfield. So while you guys are all slaves to the new AI robotic masters, I'm cleaning boot drives. This is just beyond. You know, I love the fact that our main segment is on ethics because the news, this is where we need to be right now. We keep moving that line farther and farther. This is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, what was fascinating about this video is that we've seen a number of different humanoid robots. We discussed just a couple episodes ago the new Figure 1 robot. And I guess there's a couple big things that are different about this one. For one, if you look historically at what our Boston Dynamic has done, and they've been around for a couple of decades now at this point, doing some really interesting robotic stuff. So these are the guys that had the robotic dog that you saw the videos of the guys kicking back and forth, and already kind of had that idea rolling in people's minds of the robots are going to remember this. They also had those videos of the robots doing various different acrobatics and parkour across different structures. And now what they're advertising this as is their first all-electric robot. So this one is not hydraulic powered like the past ones. And I do know that they're also currently doing a lot of research and development into end-to-end neural networks for these systems. I haven't seen anything to suggest that is what this is yet. I know traditionally most of their robotics have been more traditional style programming and not as focused on the emerging machine learning world. So, but the thing that was most terrifying to me about this is even though structurally it is humanesque, the way it moves is like something out of The Exorcist. You just see its hips contorting. It's able to roll its legs around in order to lift itself up, turn its head 100 or 360 degrees. So
I'm just waiting for this thing to start walking, get down on all fours, walk backwards, and climb up the wall.
And in the video, it does pretty close to that. I mean, can you imagine wrestling this thing?
Oh, I'll give you a better question. Can you imagine going up to somebody's door, knocking, and that's what answers it?
Yeah.
The one we keep seeing all of these robotics, but the one thing that we don't really get into much is, and I know we got another segment and a lot more news to get to, but just real quick, how would this actually look if you integrated it into your everyday life? I mean, what does that even look like? Is it a butler? Is it, a tool? I mean, we're showing functionality, but just imagine what that would look like.
I think probably where we will see these first integrating into the world is probably in factory type labor. I think that we're probably a little bit further off from this guy in your home, but I do think we'll get there probably within the next 5 to 10 years. And to your point, I mean, I guess anything and everything until something goes sideways, right?
Oh, can we please bring up the point about the five, laws of robotics, please? OpenAI, Microsoft, Google, all of you, do no harm. Does this mean anything to anybody?
Right, precisely. And I think the one thing this does highlight, consistent with our last segment on the Figure 1 robot, is that humanoid robotics is very, very close.
Yeah. So we're just going to have to kind of keep an eye on the space, but it's going to get really interesting.
Yep. And speaking of space,
Oh,
so of course I guess it probably helps to have a little bit of background here.
yeah.
So traditionally, we have deployed satellites in high Earth orbit. And so one of the things that's uniquely different about Elon Musk's SpaceX and specifically their Starlink satellites is that they are low Earth orbit satellites. So they are just high enough to achieve orbit. And a research study was just published, which suggests that increasing the amount of aluminum space junk into low Earth orbit does risk the potential of damaging our magnetosphere, which is essentially the layer of the atmosphere that protects us from harmful radiation and solar flares of the sun.
Kind of ironic that we're doing this episode on Earth Day.
Are we?
We are.
Yeah,
we're doing our part.
Yeah, it shows how green I am. I didn't even realize. I'll go plant a tree after this.
Oh, but to that point, this is not just, an us problem. This is a global problem. So I wanted to throw that out there right off the bat. It doesn't matter if it's a US satellite, another country's satellite, junk is junk. And the fact that we keep putting things out there without any kind of plan of how to deal with it, aside from letting it fall back into the atmosphere and burn up. I mean, it seems like we're basically laying our own minefield to try and get through it if further exploration of space or any type of interplanetary type of travel is to be expected.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is so. That comes back to an interesting theory that came out, I want to say in the 80s, from a NASA scientist named Kessler, who created the idea of the Kessler syndrome. And this is the idea that if you start filling up low Earth orbit with, as we're seeing now, a bunch of space junk, it only takes theoretically a small number of collisions until you have, or explosions. And we already know that Russia has been testing blowing up our satellites out of the sky, but just a handful of these, and we end up in a situation where we have essentially cascading debris just running into each other.
Of friction. Once something explodes, it's going to go off in whatever direction at whatever velocity and continue at that velocity until it hits something else.
And at thousands of miles an hour, and just continue to shatter everything until, like you said, we end up in a situation which is problematic for the entire planet, where maybe we might not even be able to host any kind of, or sustain any kind of satellites in space. All global communication goes away at that point.
And I was about to say, at that point, we're back to, smoke signals and signal lights.
Yep. And so we already knew that this was a potential problem with low Earth orbit satellites. So now this idea that we are potentially jeopardizing the equilibrium of the entire planet is just one more thing to add to that list of existential threats.
But yet we still don't have any plan to deal with this. I mean, if we take a look, and believe me, I'm old school. I was born before the days of recycling. But I mean, like I said, today's Earth Day, there's a major focus on, the health of the planet, globally, in modern times, but we're not addressing the junk that we've already left.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this is that it's not just Elon Musk.
No.
Bezos also has his own company, which is attempting to catch up with Starlink and SpaceX, where they are going to want to deploy a whole fleet of low Earth orbit satellites. And it begs the question, how many different companies can deploy private satellites into this low Earth orbit space until we have a serious problem on our hands? And
Yeah,
and it seems like it's a relatively unregulated
I was going to say
area.
there doesn't seem to be a lot of oversight. And I don't know if that's just not long-term thinking or just we'll call it financial gain. But we before we start adding more, we need to address what's there in some way, shape, or form. But the idea of whether or not we're going to go with Starlink or Amazon Wi-Fi or whatever they want to call it, you know, this stuff has got to have a line and a limit somewhere.
Yep, agreed.
So MITRE, everyone out there should be pretty familiar with what MITRE is. If you're not, it is one of the most well-recognized post-breach tools out there. This is the tool that you can use to literally map out an entire attack from inception, what tools, tactics, procedures were used. And this is basically your go-to for digital forensics response. It's one of the top frameworks. And what do you know? These guys are just as susceptible to attack as all the rest of us out there. They fell victim to a series of 0 days that actually allowed the attackers to get into their actual infrastructure and gain initial access to their VMware infrastructure using a compromised administrator's accounts. Ultimately paving the way for the deployment of backdoors, web shells. They wound up getting persistence, did a massive amount of credential harvesting. Now, the one thing that MITRE is saying is that they were not able to breach the core network, and no third-party contractors or resources were affected. So, even though these guys are this is the top of the line type of tool for forensics and response, even they can fall victim. The idea of saying we are secure in today's world, I think, is just a sentence that should be removed from the English vocabulary.
Yeah, agreed. We still see companies that advertise, or even security solutions that advertise 100% safe protection. And I think you're right. I think especially when I think this goes to show that one, cybersecurity is really hard. And that's it's even difficult just to square away the basics, the fundamentals, the general security hygiene that any company should have. But then when you start taking into consideration nation state level threats and 0-day attacks, you really do start having to get to a point where you approach things from an assumed breach perspective. You assume that the
I'm
company
already
that you're
there.
working with is breached, and what can we do to minimize the impact?
And to that point, that's one of the things that I will give MITRE a lot of props for. These guys were really quick on the public disclosures, and even their president came out and said no organization is immune from this type of cyber attack, not even the one that strives to maintain the highest cybersecurity possible. So this is, a quick point on 0 days. They're called 0 days because nobody's ever seen them before. So this is why constant vigilance around patching, change management control, this stuff is basic cyber hygiene, and we shouldn't be talking about it here in 2024, but we need to, because given a long enough timeline and enough resources, nobody is safe.
Agreed. And for our final news article, so we talked about it was in one of our previous episodes, the last couple. It may have even been our last
I think it
episode that
was the
we
last
did.
one.
Yep, we talked about how Microsoft had basically decided to commit $100 billion, so this obscene amount of money, to continuing to scale out larger neural networks and essentially build out a supercomputer they were calling Stargate. Well, more recently, Google, and specifically the DeepMind CEO, was confronted in a conference about Microsoft's plan to do that, and just further committing to continuing this scaling arms race that we're seeing between tech companies. He doubles down and essentially says, Google's doing the same thing. We are also investing $100 billion to build out a larger and larger AI power.
The scary thing about that is I think it was actually in our last episode also was the report that was delivered to the DoD on the potential ways of addressing the AI threat. And if you remember, one of the things that they were talking about was actually rate limiting hardware and things. So just what we're seeing from the corporations compared to what we're getting out of Washington, we couldn't be at more polar opposite ends of the extremes. We've got the government talking about limiting, and we've got the biggest corporations on the world basically committing to the GDP of some third world countries. I mean, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and I think it just goes to show that the tech companies are going to be profit driven and have very little concern for, I mean, what really is. And the crazy thing is, you listen to conversations or interviews that any of these tech leaders have, and they acknowledge that there is a significant risk to what we are doing and the trajectory that we're going down. But I guess
Doesn't seem to stop anybody, and it doesn't slow anybody down.
Yep, cash is king. I guess you profits are what we're after, and so I think until there is a regulatory landscape that requires them to slow down. I mean, we can have government issued reports all day long. We can have executive orders that are just broad and fluffy, but don't really establish anything. But until we have something that really holds their feet to the fire, we're going to continue to see this scaling race continue.
It's going to get bad. It's going to get bad.
Yeah, for sure.
So, main segment. Balancing ethics with rapid innovation. This one is very near and dear to me, especially after doing a lot of the research for some of the stuff that I've been putting into my upcoming book. I'd like to kick the conversation off, Hutch, by asking you this. How would you respond to, can ethics remain as is as we move into the future with not only technology around us, but technology that's being integrated into us as well?
I think not only is it going to have to change, but I think it's also going to have to enter into our understanding of ethics, and the way that we approach it is going to have to enter a state of constant fluctuation because of the fact that year over year, day over day, things are changing so rapidly, and that is so quickly adjusting the way that we interact with each other, the way that we interact with the world. And there are ethical implications to all of that. So I think that almost everything about the way we operate, we are going to have to reflect back on consistently as we move further into the future to reassess and recalibrate.
I think that's a really good answer. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was doing the research on the book is, we see all of these amazing new opportunities and projections for some of the upcoming technology around brain computer interfaces. Right now, everything is basically still dealing in addressing deficiencies of injured human beings, either Parkinson's, some type of paralysis, lack of speech, locked in. These are giving those types of patients the ability to communicate again. But, as we said in our episode about BCIs, we are very limited in functionality right now. We have up, down, left, right, click, but what we're seeing is the potential use cases moving beyond the medical. The ability to interface to computers on a faster backplane than traditional IO, we'd be going directly from, electrical brain impulse to computer receptor. Where do we see this moving forward? Because if we take a look at, by today's standards, this would probably be considered body dysmorphia or some type of dysmorphia. The wanting to have some type of surgical implant or a modification for the purposes outside of addressing a biologically deficient limb or organ.
It's an interesting perspective. Have you had people that have, because obviously, given your background and the fact that you have multiple different implants, and I think mostly for, I would say, enhancement purposes more than addressing a
Every
medical
one of them is
illness.
for enhancements, but yeah, I've been accused of having that.
Interesting.
But to that point, and by no means, I'm going to throw this out. We're not trying to make fun of any type of mental condition at all. These are just, theoretical kind of discussions. So if you do have some kind of body dysmorphia, please get proper help. We are not here to give medical advice. But one of the things that I was, trying to discuss with, and throwing out there is I can understand the concept behind body dysmorphia given today's current situation. But what if we're in a situation where the prosthetic limbs are able to actually be superior to the biological? I can see where today, if I can, let's say I didn't like my hand and I wanted to cut it off, the opportunity to have a functional hand that would be equal to what my biological hand would be somewhat limited. But like you said, with the technology over the next 5 to 10 years, the prosthetics may reach a point where they're actually superior. So in that case, if we're looking at a body dysmorphia diagnosis, does that actually solve the issue? If we were, to say, all right, well, now you can have a hand that'll do the same thing. Does this address that? Not a medical doctor, but, I'm looking at it from more of a social perspective. Having a hook, back in the 30s and 40s, if you lost your limb, you get the old, janitor hook from the janitor at elementary school. But now we can do better.
Yeah, I think we are going to see a transition. I'm not sure. I think that probably will not be an overnight thing. I think that's going to gradually change in terms of people's perspectives. So I think that you're on one end of that, where you are already seeing the value in potential integration with technology. I think that obviously there are going to be people on the far end of the other spectrum that hold out regardless of once society starts moving that direction. But I do think that, to your point, we are going to hit a stage where technological augmentation results in superior capabilities. And traditionally, we've seen this idea that you have to adapt to emerging technology that gives you an edge, because if you don't, you get left behind. If you were a company and you didn't get on the internet, you don't exist today. If you are even a person operating in day-to-day life, if you don't have a mobile phone and haven't joined into the smartphone era, then your ability to even function as a professional in a world where everybody is on call and there's constantly a need to be connected. I think there is that implicit requirement. Nobody is telling you have to adapt, but there is that implicit requirement that you adapt or you get left behind. And I think that technological augmentation of humans is going to
law of
go
natural consequences. Wouldn't that be the reference? We're not telling you that you have to adopt the technology, but as a society, if you don't, there are natural consequences to those actions.
Yeah, absolutely. There were, I mean, I think it's just that you get left behind. And I think that we're going to hit a point where right now, I think there are benefits to many of the capabilities that you have, but I don't think that there are benefits that would appeal to an average person, right? No average person is going to want to break into a phone or trace magnetic.
The only one that I could potentially see being more generally adopted would be the credit card or the crypto bionic security chip.
The Vivo key.
the Vivo key. Aside from that, I don't see any real widespread standard use cases for the types of implants that I have.
But I think we do get there, right? And when that
Oh,
happens,
absolutely.
I think to your point that we are going to start seeing a shift of moving from people perceiving it as almost a medical disorder of body dysmorphia to this is something that get on board or get left behind.
Yeah, and that's what I kind of the point that I was getting at earlier is, do we reach a point where body dysmorphia becomes selective upgrade?
And I think,
Especially if we're dealing in industrial types of formats, the idea that you could have some type of a mechanical hand that had the ability to have hundreds of pounds of strength and grip pressure is not out of the question.
yeah, and is it even selective upgrade if we get to a point where, again, get on or get left behind? If you
Well,
almost
let's be honest, it'll always be selective upgrade because none of these upgrades are going to come for free. So we'll definitely probably still see some of the same type of social classes, but it'll be, are you going to have the 4K optics in your eyes, or are you going to have the 720?
Yep.
But I do think that it does, the one thing that it does kind of open up the idea to, and I know this is right out of the cyberpunk, kind of fantasy, but where does this open up to, the idea of black market body mods? If you take a look back in the early 2000s, when you had people like the crew from Grindhouse Wetware who were coming out and with the Firefly tattoos and the Circadia implants, all the different stuff, and they were trying to start that movement and turn it into something commercial. What would happen if, say, Jeff Bezos or even better, Elon Musk decided to come out with some kind of smart implant that would, what could you imagine if Elon Musk offered an implant for your Tesla that you, just like you could buy from the shops that I buy my implants from, in terms of just getting some backing and acknowledgement from somebody that has that kind of influence?
Yeah, and I'm sure we will get to a point where we see the Elon Musk of that type of technology. It may even be Elon Musk himself. But I think we are going to have to see a transition to move away from, I guess, the stigma of perspective on this type of technology beyond people that are using it for essential medical care.
Absolutely. And if we look beyond just the medical, let's go back to social media for a minute, Hutch. We're talking about morals and ethics. How do we even reconcile the concept of ethics when social media, its only purpose in existence is to exploit the user?
Yeah, it's I completely agree. I mean, that is essentially, as we've said many times, you are the product. And so it is, I think there are inherent ethical concerns about the entire business model associated with social media. I think that one thing that may be valuable in terms of talking about ethics in the context of technology is kind of bring it back to first principles and how do we determine if something is or isn't ethical. And I think traditionally we have this idea of the utilitarianism approach of something is ethical if it is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So minimizing harm and maximizing happiness or well-being. And I think from that perspective, there's absolutely an argument for social media being problematic, because if we take that utilitarianism approach, we are essentially evaluating the ethical quality of something based on the consequences. And we've seen the consequences of social media. We've seen the damage that it has created. And I think we have to make that decision of weighing the good against the bad. But I think there's also a discussion to be had for, is utilitarianism the right approach? Because then we have that famous thought exercise of the train is barreling down a track, and there are two people tied to the track that it is going towards, and you have the ability to pull a lever that's going to divert that train. But if you pull that lever, it's going to go onto another set of tracks where there's one person tied to. And so, of course, the utilitarianism perspective is I essentially that I pull that lever, and then that is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Only one person dies instead of two people dies. But that one person then has died as a result or a direct consequence of my actions. And so while it holds up in utilitarianism, I think it becomes potentially problematic in the fact that there was a death that was the direct consequence of deliberate action. And if we look at the way that technology is moving, if we look at something like self-driving cars, where I think there is a utilitarian argument, and it's the one that most of the self-driving car companies are making, which is that less people will die if this happens. And while that's arguably true, I think it depends on what criteria you use. Yeah. And we'll probably get there to where less people will die. But the people that will die may be under very different circumstances than it would have been before. If we look at the recent incident that we had with not Waymo, but the Cruise. The incident with Cruise, where there was a pedestrian that was struck and knocked into the path of the Cruise vehicle and got trapped under the vehicle. And the Cruise vehicle, not being aware or understanding that it was dragging a person, did a pull-off maneuver where it moved to a safe place off the side of the road, and the whole while is dragging a person under the chassis of the vehicle. And so you have situations like that where maybe overall there's less deaths, but something like that probably wouldn't have happened if it was a human driver that was driving it. And so how do you reconcile those ethical situations if you are a family member of the person that is dragged under that vehicle, where that event probably wouldn't have occurred had we taken that deliberate action of pulling that lever, of implementing self-driving cars? And so I think that there is this unique conundrum of, is it the correct way to think about things? And I think you can apply this to a lot of different areas with technology. Of course, we now have we have robots that are capable of doing surgeries to do brain surgery.
And I had a robot that replaced my knee.
Yep. And probably are I think in most cases more capable than a human surgeon, because you don't have to worry about the jitters or some of the other kind of human flaws that you have. But potentially you have other oversights. And so again, we're in that situation where if we change the trajectory the way that we're going, we pull that lever and we enable machines to do this instead of people, then maybe less people die, but different people die. That is now the deliberate consequence of our actions. So I think I don't have the right answers, but I think there is that very interesting discussion of how do we weigh ethics in a world that is so rapidly changing.
Well, to that point, do you think ethics cross cultural lines?
I think so. I think that I guess maybe I should clarify the question, but are you speaking in terms of, because I think there is that problem of nationalism where, from a lot of perception, people's perspective.
Well, I'll even change it up a little bit and rephrase the question. Do you think that the standard concept of what you just said can be influenced by, say, political affiliation? Oh, goodness gracious. Type of government, democratic over dictatorship? Do you think that the concept of ethics could be skewed by cultural and societal perception?
I think that what is ethical, what ought to be in terms of ethics, in theory, should not be influenced by that. That being said, I do think that people's perception of ethics is drastically influenced by their ideology, by their political affiliation, and largely by the experiences that they've had. I mean, I have no doubt that my perspective of ethics is very different than somebody that, say, has lived in a third world country, has not had the same level of privilege that I am, has not had the same experiences that I have. And
the reason I bring this up is, and to this point, is the House recently passed a bill that, if it makes its way through, would force the sale of a social media company. So is this
good old TikTok. I'll say
good
it.
old TikTok? So,
Yep.
I mean, here's a real life use case of exactly what we're talking about. You know, the House passed a bill that would force ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, to divest the app or face a ban within 1 year.
Yeah, and I think this is largely nationalism driven. I think that there is a historic
So,
xenophobia that exists between us and China. We are afraid of them. They are terrified
right.
of us.
But the way that it's being posed in terms of the propaganda and the messaging around it is they're using it nationalism, but they're almost doing it almost like on a moral crusade or an ethical crusade.
Which is ironic if you look at what our tech companies are doing. So I think there's two elements to this. I think there is that irony of, if you contrast this or compare this to what our tech companies are doing. I mean, we just talked about during our last episode the fact that Mark Zuckerberg was essentially implanting malware on user devices to monitor communications
Snapchat.
outside of even the Facebook network. And so, and of course, has just this long history of violations of privacy. And he's not alone in this. You look at any of the major social media platforms, and that's the case. So I think there is that double standard that probably shouldn't exist. But also, my understanding is, and admittedly, I have not gone through line by line this proposed legislation, but my understanding is that this is largely a kind of a front end for create or assigning extremely overarching powers to
Oh
the
yeah.
executive branch, where the executive branch can decide what countries are considered a rival country, and then can, based on that decision, impose restrictions around their ability to compete in
Yeah.
commerce within the United States. And so, I mean, I've seen quite a few concerns that raise this to the level of kind of the Patriot Act, when you consider the over empowerment
Yeah.
of government that is kind of all sitting behind that facade of, we're trying to protect people
And if I'm not
from Chinese
mistaken,
surveillance.
this was actually attached to a bill that was actually originally for support for Ukraine. So, yeah, talk about running rimshot around to try and get some laws passed.
Yeah, and
But I
unfortunately, I
do
think
think,
we see this way too often with our political system too.
but the sad part is due to the messaging, I think it actually waters down what people expect in terms of ethical decisions from our regulators. You know, we can, like you said, we can attack this one because, you know, they're not from here, but we are doing the exact same thing. So if we're doing this for nationalism, come out and say we're doing it for nationalism. But if to come out and try and say that we're doing this to protect the children, you know, and try and take a moral or an ethical high ground, when, you know, you've got Facebook and X and Instagram and every other social media doing the exact same thing, I think it causes a deterioration within the social fabric in terms of the expectations.
I would agree. So I guess with that, Blinn, what, from your perspective, should people take away from this discussion on ethics in innovation?
I think, in my opinion, what people need to really take away from this is that the change is going to happen. And ultimately, I think ethics and morals, they're unique to every individual. Now, whether or not they line up with what society claims is the general consensus or not, you know, that's an individual thing. But the one thing that I would say is, you know, as we continue to move forward into this more integrated world with the technology, is never forget that we are individual, and don't be a sheeple. You know, if you
Think for
have
yourself.
if you have beliefs, be willing to stand up for them.
I think that for me, what is crucial about this conversation is just that, the conversation. It
Mhm.
is the fact that I'm can't tell you what the right answers are as far as
Mhm.
ethics. To your point, everybody's going to have a different perspective based on their background. But again, like you said, if you have an opinion, I think the ability to and the value of voicing that is absolutely critical. I think that the way that we get through this rapidly changing landscape that we are going to see as we move further and further into the future is that we come
We
to
have,
some kind
we
of
have,
sensible consensus.
and we have to talk and communicate.
Absolutely.
Anything else you got for today, boss?
No, I think for me that is it. I'm excited to see what the future holds, but at the same time, I think that we are going to have to continue to rely on each other, be able to have those conversations and those discussions, and so I think that this is a good starting point. I don't think that we
Absolutely.
solve all the world's problems here, but I think that if nothing else, having this conversation, opening up, welcoming all of our listeners to engage in this conversation as well and provide their perspectives, whether back to us or just in some kind of other general forum, is going to be
Absolutely.
how we
One
move.
last thing. You got any book signings, any events coming up?
I do. I think it's pretty clear what you were hitting at there. So yes, in RSA, which is in 2 weeks. And let me look at the actual date here so that I am not saying the wrong one. But for anybody that is going to be out at RSA, I will be presenting on Thursday, which is May 9th, in the morning in San Francisco, and then immediately after that, we'll be doing a book signing for my book. So thank you for that lead into the plug, and for anybody that is going to be out at RSA, would love to see you and have a conversation.
All right. And I don't know when this will come out, but if you're in the Houston area on the 25th of April, I will be spending some time with the HughesCon team and going down there to speak at their users group. So come on out and say hello.
Oh man, is it that soon? That's not far
Yeah.
away at all.
Yeah. Be down there to visit you in 2 days, 3 days.
Awesome.
So
Can't wait to see you.
with that, I appreciate everybody's taking their time to listen to me ramble. Thank you very much.
All right. Cyber Cognition over and out.
Peace.